Hey, dickheads, like a pink laser beam of truth beaming from across the internet to your brain hole. I am your resident dickhead, David Agronoff, here to host another one of our live dickhead hangouts on Tuesday night here in real time. We just released the Ray Naylor episode into the world from the recording process, but wherever you're at, there's probably a lot more out there, so you can find them. If this is your first time watching one of these videos, know that on most Tuesdays should be you can be a part of this discussion. For those of you who are here live tonight, the next 3 weeks we have tentatively, and I'm pretty sure it's going to happen. Sam J. Miller, who is the Nebula Award-winning author of Blackfish City, and is a current teacher at the Clarion Workshop and a graduate. So we'll be talking about what the modern Clarion Workshop is like, because we've talked about what it was like in the 70s with John Shirley. And now I wanted to hear from someone who's at the modern one. Then we're going to have at least one of, if not both, the co-editors and several of the contributors to the Esoteric Theology of Philip K. Dick. Did I get the title right, Blake? I believe that's the yes. And Blake is a contributor to this anthology. Blake, what's the name of your essay? Are you far from your mute button?
Hi, David.
You're trying to remember the title?
It is called The Conquest of Death and the Divine Afterlife, Resurrection in Philip Dick's mid-60s work or something like that.
Cool. Well, we're going to have the editors and probably Blake will be here to talk about that book. And then on June 30th, we are going to have three-time Bram Stoker Award-winning author and best-selling author Sarah Langan, who at one time had the same agent as Philip K. Dick. Not at the same time, but she had one of Philip K. Dick's agents. But she's a dickhead, and she wrote two recent science fiction novels, Good Neighbors and A Better World, which I think are great. She has said that she might want to assign a short story for everybody to read and talk about, but I will let you know if that happens. She is deciding that in the next couple days. So that's who we got coming up here in real time. Of course, if you're watching this later on the YouTube feed, these will all come out on the YouTube feed eventually. So, that being said, our guest tonight is Stephen Shaviro, and he is a fantastic commentator on science fiction. He's a retired Wayne State professor, and he has written at least, am I correct, Stephen, 4 books on science fiction commentary already, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah. And currently working writing a book on a film called Neptune Frost, which we're going to talk a little bit about. I told everyone to watch it this week, but I don't know. I might be the only one that watched it. I don't know. I did watch it last night, though. I did watch it after playing 4 games of basketball, so I was a little tired. I admit that, but I think I got it. But if you're like, what movie did you watch? That's why. So, Stephen, can you tell the folks a little bit about how you got into science fiction criticism? You've been a science fiction fan most of your life, I take it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I started reading science fiction when I was a kid. I think I actually probably read like Tom Swift Jr. books when I was like 5 or 6. But when I was 9 years old, my Uncle Morris, who was a science fiction fan, as well as a French professor, was his day job, gave me Triplanetary by Doc Smith, and I read that. And I sort of started reading science fiction after that. So there were a lot of flaws in Doc Smith compared to some of the best science fiction, but that he was my starting point. So I'd say that was one step. I mean, I continued through school. When I was in graduate school in the late 1970s, my cohort of graduate students included several other people who became well-known science fiction critics, Carl Friedman and John Reeder. And the 3 of us were all into science fiction and talked about it, especially about Philip K. Dick, at a time when it wasn't really taught in academia yet.
Right.
So that, I
Well,
mean,
we'll get to Philip K. Dick, obviously, because he's the reason for the season, as it were. But I know you're you're a huge fan of my introduction to your work was presenting a paper in the same slot
yeah,
where you were doing a paper on I was doing DC Fontana and you were doing Joanna Russ.
yeah.
So who are your go-to favorites? Would Russ be one of the ones that you would consider your
Yes,
favorite?
I mean, well, it's really hard to keep a stable list because there are different waves and different. I mean, science fiction now has a considerable history. What I read as a young adult and then into through college, graduate school, were, I think, the cohort of science fiction writers who became well known in the 1960s. We'd include Philip K. Dick, obviously, alongside with um, Joanna Russ, Ursula Le Guin, Samuel R. Delany, and several others. And so that was part of so that's kind of a background canon for me. But I mean, I keep on I try not to dwell in the past, meaning that I try to follow more recent generations of science fiction writers. I was going to say another stage in my science fiction orientation, if that's the right word, was when my first academic job from 1984 to 2004 was in the University of Washington in Seattle. And at that time, not only did I have Joanna Russ as a colleague in the English department at the University of Washington, but that was also sort of the time when I guess two big trends, feminist science fiction and cyberpunk, started to become big. So, a lot of it was William Gibson was in Vancouver, not in Seattle, but he's he came out with Neuromancer in 1987, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are other people like Bruce Sterling and others who started writing. And so this became a kind of movement, and I, was following along with it. I also got to know some actual science fiction writers when I was in Seattle who are still there now and still writing, including Eileen Gunn and Nisi Scholl, both of whom have published maybe more recently, but were already a big part of the science fiction community in Seattle in the 1990s. So that
Yeah.
would be another stage. And then I started as an academic. I wrote about other things. Couldn't write a dissertation on science fiction at that time because it wasn't quite a legitimate subject, but I wrote about French post-structuralists. I wrote about avant-garde and experimental film. And then I started to write about science fiction as well. I think my first article after my dissertation was about William Burroughs, who may be a science fiction writer, but maybe not. But I mean, I quickly started to write, to do other things. And so my first book about science fiction um, was Connected, or What It Means to Live in the Network Society, which is largely a book-length reading of one science fiction novel, Noir by K.W. Jeter.
Mm-hmm.
K.W. Jeter's sort of, I mean, he's still around. He's old now, so I don't know what he's older than me. I'm 71, so he's probably in his 80s. He knew Philip K. Dick at the very end of Dick's life, and he started writing both science fiction and horror fiction. Interestingly, he's an uneven writer. His book Noir, like film, I mean, as in film noir, though, is a monumental work, which I still think is underrated in science fiction. Anyway, it sort of inspired me to write a whole book length thing, which talked about a lot of everybody else from Dick to Delany to Russ to others, but was focused on this one novel because of Jeter's, because it seemed to be so monumental and to contain so many other things. It's also a little scary. I mean, I don't think Jeter's ever found out that I wrote a book about him, which may be just as well, since in the book Noir, there's a enormous passage where the book, it basically describes in incredible detail the vicious and horrifying torture of somebody who violates copyright. And violating copyright is a big thing and I understand it because, if science fiction writers are depending on their income from royalties, they're very worried about picking up, stuff in pirated form. But, it made me feel a little worried that what if KW Jeter reads my book and then says he's going to come after me for, so I mean,
And
that
then
may
he
be,
comes to torture you, right?
well,
Is the concern.
it's really weird when you write about contemporary writers, you sort of, at least I want to, I want them to like what I wrote about them. And I'm very gratified if I hear from one of them that they liked what I wrote about their books or whatever. On the other hand, there've been a couple cases where they hated what I wrote about their books, and I didn't always know why, but it's kind of disconcerting since I don't write about books I'm not like a critic of newspaper who writes, is this good or this bad? I mean, I only write about stuff that inspires me and that I'm enthusiastic about. And so,
Well,
um,
and it should be said too, Stephen, that you are very learned in the history going back to the pulps, but you, sir, read modern science fiction very, because I'm one of those people too. I read both the
yeah,
modern stuff and I read the retro stuff. And by the way, and before I move on, I do want to point out for if there's a few new people, if at any point you want to ask a question on the bottom bar of Zoom there on the reactions, you can raise your hand and ask a question at any time. So, but yeah, you read both the modern stuff and you read the retro stuff, or at least you
yeah.
have a memory for it because you read it back in the day.
Well, I know I try. I mean, it depends on what I'm actually reading. I mean, I just finished reading, for instance, this is just a for instance, The Black Cloud by Fred Hoyle. Fred
Mhm.
Hoyle was this famous astronomer in the 50s through the 70s. I guess he didn't die until like 1990, but he made some essential discoveries about formation of heavier elements out of hydrogen and helium in stars. But he also was the big advocate for the steady state theory of the universe, which argued that the Big Bang never happened because the universe had been expanding and it was already infinite, it was expanding forever. So historically, he has some hits and some strikes, but he also wrote science fiction novels. And this novel, The Black Cloud, which is from the early 1960s, is about an enormous black cloud from outer space, which comes to the solar system and goes around the sun and blocks out the light of the sun for a while and causes catastrophe on Earth. But it turns out it's an intelligent entity. And eventually the scientists managed to talk with it. So
Yeah,
it's
that sounds
again,
right
it's
up
one of
my
those things
alley. I think
filled,
I have to look for
it's
that one.
I don't know. I mean, it's one of these things filled with ideas. I mean, they're old ideas because this book was like from 1965 or something like that.
Yeah.
And some of
Well,
his ideas about astronomy have been, you know, rejected in more recent times, but it's still I mean, I just give that an example. Not that I want to privilege that book in particular, but there's a lot of older stuff I haven't read. And so I'm always going back and forth between reading, trying to keep up with new stuff that people are talking about or the authors I really like, but also fill in a lot of the older stuff I just know about or have some ideas about.
yeah. And
Heard
it's
of.
just it's remarkable to me because a lot of people that I know through this community, like they like the old stuff and they kind of have that they don't make them like they used to attitude, and
Mhm.
no they don't, but there's a lot of good modern science fiction as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I will say too that you are a fun follow on Facebook. Now you go through waves of like more like reviews of the films you're watching, and sometimes you do. And I have found great movies from your posts about the films you're watching. And
Hmm.
I remember there was one time where you posted a Jewish rom com about a bar mitzvah, and when I said, "Oh, I'm gonna have to check that out," you made sure to say, "Well, hey, this is some fluffy stuff," but
Well, I mean, you watch different things. I mean, Adam Sandler, for instance, is one of the most popular comedians of the last 20, 30 years. Now really has a deal with Netflix. His films don't go to the theaters anymore. They all go to Netflix right away and never play in theaters, which is an interesting economic model. But he does a lot of fluffy stuff. He's done serious acting in other people's films. His own films tend to be kind of slack comedies, but some are better than others. But I mean, I guess the film you talked about was one about it was a family project. His wife and his daughters acted in the film, and
yeah.
it's about the 13-year-old girl whose best friend they have a falling out before their bat mitzvahs, which occur in separate on successive weeks. And so I mean, it's not a
And what was
great
the name
film,
of that
but
movie? Just because we brought it up.
you are so not invited to my bat mitzvah.
Yeah, right. And I remember just being appreciative that I found it because you posted about it. But here's the thing: you do a lot of film commentary. You do almost more film than you do the books. Like, how did that come about?
Well, I mean, I was a film studies professor for 40 years in academia. So, I mean, I got my PhD in English literature, English and American literature, mostly 19th, 20th century. But I most, but I was always interested in film. I mean, I was fanatically interested in film for a very long time. And remember when I went to college and graduate school was days before we had any VCRs, let alone DVDs or any kind of, or streaming, any kind of, you really couldn't watch old films at home. So at the colleges, they had lots of film societies where they'd show 16 millimeter prints of old films. So for years I would go to these film societies 4 or 5 times a week, and then at late night, my other education in old Hollywood films was watching TV like from midnight to 4 in the morning, where they play old Hollywood films, because this is the 70s, so they didn't have the new films. So that was the beginning. So I mean, I was very interested in film and wanted to write about film and think about film before there was much in the way of film programs. In fact, I was a graduate student and then an adjunct teaching for a few years after at Yale University, which is now, which is one of the big Ivy League schools. At the time, they didn't have a film program. They had, as a junior faculty person, David Roderick, who they wouldn't give tenure to because they didn't believe in having a film program. And he recently retired. He's like one of the 4 or 5 best known academic film theorists, film scholars. And Yale could have had him, and they refused to give him tenure because at that point they didn't have a film program. Now, of course, they do, because everybody has a film program, and Yale, because it's Yale, has a very powerful, high-ranking film program with major scholars. But this kind of thing didn't exist that widely in academia when I was in graduate school and an adjunct in the late 70s, early 80s. So I was doing film scholarship, writing about films and watching lots of films, but it wasn't quite an academic area, and I wasn't hired for it. When I went to the University of Washington in 1984, I was hired as a romantic poetry person. And I tried to teach.
That's very different.
Well, but there was like one film class on the books, so I teach that every year. And what turned out to happen, and this is like one particular university, but I don't think it's that different from what happened in other places. In the late 1980s, there were all these people who wanted to start a film program and hire film people, but they couldn't do it because the university president at the time was this old line guy. I think he was a physicist, but he was an old line guy. Says, "And what are you going to do? Give him credit for eating popcorn? Ha ha ha!" So there were all these people who were like waiting for this president to retire so they could start a film program, because he wouldn't allow it. But so a new president came in and they said, look, we're going to get lots of students for this. So the president said, if you get lots of students, that's fine. And so they started a film program. And so I was one of the first people teaching film. So even though I was hired for teaching romantic poetry, I didn't write much on that. I didn't pass my dissertation. I didn't teach it all that often. And from like 1990 on, I was teaching film classes in a film program. And that was true at the University of Washington. It was true when I moved to Wayne State. So out of my 40 years in academia, except for the first 5 or 6 years, I was primarily like 80% teaching film classes. And that
Right.
has to do with the story of how film became popular in academia, or became accepted in academia.
And a lot of your science fiction commentary is about the film as much as the book, but you do a lot of writing about like the kind of philosophical angles of speculation, and so that crosses both film and books, right?
Well, I mean, I tend to write more about written science fiction than about science fiction film. I don't know. It's just because, I mean, I think it has to do with the fact of how much money it costs to make a film, and much cheaper to make. So, I mean, in novels, you often get crazier and wilder plots and crazier and wilder speculation than you do in movies, because the movies, they're going to clamp down on that given the budget. I mean, Stanley Kubrick got away with an incredible amount in 2001, and that became like the most famous science fiction, rightly the most famous science fiction film of all time. It is widely imitated, but very few other directors get the kind of carte blanche that he had in 1969 to make 2001. And so, I mean, I think it is more restriction in, I mean, there are a lot of great things. I mean, obviously, I'm interested as a film critic and a film scholar. I'm interested in visual dimensions and sound dimensions, and these are obviously things which don't exist in literature. It's not just what the words are, but how the sounds you hear and the things you see and all this kind of stuff. But it's also because just because of budgets, it's very hard to. I mean, it's very hard to get away with some of the things which are gotten away with routinely in fiction, because fiction is just on such a more it's not the same kind of monetary risk, and so there aren't money people worrying about what you can get away with.
And I imagine you stood up in front of a lot of your film studies students and told them about a lot of science fiction they ought to be checking out and reading from time to time. I'm sure
From
you
time
did
to
that a
time,
lot.
but I stuck to film when I taught film. I mean, basically, this it's there's so much you can. I mean, I did various areas of film. I mean, I did um mainstream Hollywood from the beginning of sound in late 1920s up to like 1980. And so, I mean, there are all these there's lots of things there. I did stuff on, I think I once did a class on the French New Wave. I once did a class on Eastern European cinema under communism from 1950s through 1989. And I did a class on vampire movies. That was actually my last class before I retired. I did a class on film noir and I did a class on melodrama and other and musicals, other Hollywood genres. So, there's lots of stuff just in film, which I
Yeah, I
mean,
remember you talking about your vampire class, and I was like really wishing I had been able to take it. I correct me if I'm wrong, but your first book about cinema in your bibliography is The Cinematic Body, correct?
yes, that is
Yeah.
correct.
Can you give us an overview of what the meta text of that is?
Well, that I was trying to think about sort of how films are visceral and, affect you physically, mentally and physically, but, you feel strong emotions. You might have, clenching feelings in your stomach with horror films and stuff like that. And I thought that in academic film criticism at the time, there wasn't enough attention being paid to that. So I had chapters on people like Cronenberg, which is sort of before Cronenberg became as popular and famous as he's been more recently, about George Romero and his zombie trilogy, which is more than a trilogy because he made later in his career, he made more, but and and stuff like that. I was interested in sort of how film meanings can't be separate from the way they provoke visceral bodily feelings and emotions.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, as the author of that book, how you felt watching The Substance this year come close to to the fact that everyone thought that Demi Moore was snubbed, at the
Well, she
Oscars this
probably
year.
was. I mean, awards are their own weird thing, which you could comment on. But I mean, I thought The Substance was a great film. I thought it was quite wonderful. And again, it was dealing with, issues of body image, but also it was visceral just in the way what you actually saw on screen. It was icky in a very powerful way.
Yeah.
In terms of things like Oscars, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I felt, a lot of times they give Oscars to films I don't value very much. On the other hand, when they gave the Oscar to Everything Everywhere All at Once, I mean, my feeling when I watched Everything Everywhere All at Once, I almost felt like it wasn't true. I felt like, oh, these directors have read my film books and they tried to make a film which would be exactly what appealed to me personally the most. And
Right.
so I was not only like the film, but I was very pleased that it got awards and won all
For
the Oscars.
sure. It
So.
in but what I'm wondering is, as somebody who's written about Cronenberg since long before it was, fashionable to write about body horror, it must have been really interesting to see like the mainstream film community try to grapple with a body horror movie
Well,
like.
the thing is that there are different film communities. So the academic film community is not the same as the film community online, let's say. They have very different attitudes. And I mean, when I wrote my first book about film, a lot of there was a very sort of what seemed to me too narrow a kind of approach to film, but it wasn't a very conservative approach. It was an approach which used psychoanalysis a lot and value and talked a lot about gender in film, and it did a lot of valuable things. I, I mean, I guess I felt it wasn't icky enough, so I had to bring in the body horror. But I don't think I think in academic film criticism, academics have been very wide, and a lot of have academics have been open to that, whereas I mean, maybe journalistic film critics or people online might not have been as much, though I think it's changed now, but I mean like 30 years ago or so, 30, 40 years ago, I think. I mean, it seems to me that things are pretty wide and open right now in terms of the types of discourse you just see online, as well as in academic discourse and stuff like that. I mean, it isn't, I felt, it felt much more narrow 30 or 40 years ago. And even when it was politically radical or aesthetically radical, it still felt more narrow back then than it does now, I guess.
Well, it and far be it from me to believe any AI overview, but according to my AI overview, your most popular book is Doom Patrol's theoretical fiction about postmodernism, or the one that AI claims you're most known for. What do you feel about that claim?
I'm surprised that I'd be most known for. I mean, that was a book I had a lot of problems with, not just because of the commercial. Okay, what the story with that book is that I was publishing this book. I decided to go for it, write it in a less academic way, push myself to extremes and do all this kind of stuff, both in the style of the writing and then what I was going to write about. And I decided not to do an academic press, but to do a commercial press. So I did this commercial press called Serpent's Tail, which at the time was publishing, you know, transgressive writers like Kathy Acker, especially. And I was really happy with the press and what they're doing. And then literally like the week the book was published, the press had an economic something or other. They fired the editor who I'd been working with. They narrowed their focus, and so my book didn't get advertised at all. So I kind of felt like I was being screwed. And aside from being bad for my editor, who I really, really liked, and I thought it was terrible that they fired him. And they only fired him for as a cost-cutting measure. So
And what's the thesis for this book? What was the main focus of that one?
I was just trying to talk about weird excesses in popular culture and how it spilled over between avant-garde culture and popular culture, basically. I mean, I was trying to write a book which was very stylized and, in as well in terms of how it was written and in terms of, I mean, I wrote about serious literature, but I also wrote about popular images of Richard Nixon. I've had a lifelong Nixon fixation, though for younger people it doesn't mean much because he's been surpassed in disgustingness by Donald Trump, among others. So, I mean, it seemed, and no younger people know who Nixon was anymore, which is probably just as well. But
Hey, we're dickheads. We've got Radio Free Album Booth in
yes,
our.
I know. So I mean, yes, Ferris Fremont. I mean, Dick was somebody who lived through the Nixon years and was oppressed by them, rightly oppressed by them. So yeah, but
Yeah. Oh,
anyway,
sure.
so I
Although,
was trying to write something less academic and more popular, but very, very stylized. Like it was like a literary exercise as much as anything else.
well, one of your books that I think will be most appeal to our listeners, our viewers, since this is a YouTube exclusive,
Yes.
would be the Universe of Things. We'll come back to that one because
Okay.
I think the ideas in that one, I think, are very interesting to our peeps.
Mhm.
But Fluid Futures is your most recent release.
Yeah.
You want to tell people about, because it really ties together the four books that you've written about science fiction, from what I can
Yeah.
tell.
Well, okay. Well, I mean, here's the thing. I've been writing about science fiction for a very long time. And I decided, I mean, I tried to, put it all together. Now, my mind is not very, I think my mind's creative, but it's not very rigorously logical. So I don't have a perfect logical structure of everything, but I decided so Fluid Future is both twice as long as any other book I've written. It's like 120,000 words, and I've never written another book more than 60,000 words, I think. And I tried to sort of also my previous books about all three of my previous books about science fiction were focused on one particular work or several particular works. Um, so the first one connected was about K.W. Jeter's Noir, though it sort of detoured into a lot of other a lot of other works. And then I had several books which were about, each chapter is about a different science fiction novel or story or whatever. I mean, I tried to stretch that also. In one of my books, I wrote a chapter about the avant-garde hip hop band Clipping, who's had, who's one of whose records was actually a science fiction, a kind of deconstructed science fiction narrative, but in the form of rap song, in sort of industrial noise rap songs. But I decided I wanted something which is more broadly ranging. So Fluid Features was probably was definitely my most ambitious book, and I tried to, I mean, there's always more to say. I tried to say everything I could think about science fiction in this book, though of course there's always more because you're never complete. But so I guess there were a couple of different. I mean, I don't know how much in detail you want me to go. There's a couple of different dimensions to it.
Oh,
One
well, no, I think people would be interested. I
Okay,
mean,
well, one dimension, and so the first chapter is about what I see is 3 degrees of science fictional writing, and which I talk about as extrapolation, speculation, and fabulation. All three are words that have been used, and I'm not saying I'm finally giving the right way to use them. I'm formalizing them or giving them my own partial definitions, picking up what people said, but trying to do it as a way to organize different kinds of things. So it's sort of like extrapolation. Often science fiction is called extrapolation. Extrapolation is you take trends and push them further. And that's been something science fiction's done for a long time. I mean, when cyberpunk started in the 80s, Gibson's Neuromancer, Gibson didn't know that much about computers, but he hung out in bars and heard 1980s hackers talking, and he sort of took that as the basis and pushed it. And in some ways, obviously, it's pushed. He invented the word cyberspace as this other realm where people went into when they're online. And obviously, in a certain sense, we don't have what he had because he has the idea that you have a full 3D body, full body hallucination of being in this other space, rather than just looking at the screen. But I mean, again, he thought of trends, and he pushed the trends further, and that's extrapolation. There's the same way a really interesting and not well remembered enough science fiction writer in the 1960s, 1970s, John Brunner, was a British science fiction writer.
oh, I'm a brunette, so
Okay, great. But I mean, he wrote lots of books, but I mean, and some of them were more heavy than others. But I mean, he did these books like he did
Shockwave
in
Rider.
Zanzibar, which is let's say population explosion just becomes completely out of control. But then he did several other books in the same period, which took other trends. I'm having trouble remembering.
Shockwave Rider is probably the one.
Shockwave Rider is sort of taking both sort of the ultra violence increasingly in media, as well as technological advances in computation and pushing that as far as possible. And The Sheep Look Up was about environmental, so it was just imagining, the most worst possible outcome of environmental degradation and pollution and things like that. And so each book is like a thought experiment to say, if this particular trend continues for another 50 years, what's going to be like? So, I mean, that's extrapolation. You take real thing. Speculation goes beyond extrapolation because speculation brings you into like weirder or wackier realms, or it goes further. I mean, speculation has different meanings. Sometimes it's used in economics and finance. Speculators are people who have these investment decisions based on what I think the future will bring. But it's also speculative philosophy becomes speculative fiction, which is often a meta term used as including science fiction and other genres. And again, it's sort of like thinking about, it's beyond projecting, extrapolating technologies and more sort of rethinking like what could happen if we were able to think in this way, if we were able to do so. I mean, it's sort of like not just extrapolating technologies, but extrapolating modes of thought, ways people think about stuff. And then the last one was fabulation, which goes beyond speculation, sort of makes up stories which aren't predictions anymore, but which have some kind of hold on the present. And that's a less commonly used term. It actually comes from the French philosopher Henri Bergson, but then gets used in English and criticism in certain ways. And fabulation is basically making up stories which might either, doom us or save us. I mean, they're both. I mean, philosopher Bergson's example of fabulation was somebody was about to get into the elevator, but the elevator shaft was empty and they going to fall into the abyss because the elevator wasn't there, and they hallucinated like somebody saying, "Stop, stop, don't go." And that hallucination is a fabulation. It's a kind of something you imaginatively make up, but which actually serves a function. So it goes beyond speculating this might happen in the future, or to a kind of creating almost a mythology, though. Okay, so I mean, anyway, I'm going on too long about that, but those are like three dimensions which I see as different aspects of how science fictional creation works. And then the rest of the book, I look at other tendencies and trends. I try to think about how science fiction relates to various social trends, but also doesn't depict them, gives us distorted mirror to them and pushes it back at us. So I
Yeah,
don't know.
and I've been reading. There's a 92-page preview that anyone can get online.
Yeah.
I've been reading that because my copy that I ordered from Barnes and Nobles has not arrived yet. So
Yeah.
I really like what I've read so far.
Thanks.
And then Blake has a question, and then we'll get into the universe of things. Blake?
Okay.
Hi,
Yeah. Hi.
Professor Shaviro. Wonderful to have you as a guest.
Hi.
This may be the first Dickheads Hangout where we have gone 40 minutes without mentioning Philip Dick.
We did mention him. We did
Oh.
mention him.
Well, then I missed it.
Very briefly only.
Very briefly.
Yeah.
I was going to get to that, Blake.
Okay. Well, then
Go ahead.
I'll put my hand down and let nature take its course.
No. Ask your question.
Go ahead. Ask it, please.
Well, you've given the this sort of tripartite definition, confabulation, and so forth. What do you think are the best examples from Phil Dick's oeuvre? Meaning, we've got 40 some odd novels.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's really hard to choose because he did so much and was in so many modes. I think some of my favorite of Dick's books are just some of the middle 60s ones, which are just totally hallucinatory and insane. I'm thinking of Ubik, obviously, Martian Time Slip, and a few others, which just sort of careen outwards into more and more paranoid, weird scenarios, which
Three
sort of,
Stigmata would fit into that too.
yeah.
Okay.
And, his later stuff is different. I mean, so like a Scattered Darkly, which is a very despairing, but I mean, in a certain sense, it's more reality based than the 60s books because the way it's about addiction and how profit is being made from that and things like that.
Well, what do you think those 60s books are about? So we can read them and say, yeah, they're weird. And,
Well, again, there's this push and pull in Dick. I mean, it's later on he has a kind of Christian conversion moment, and then he tries to books like Valis, and he wants to say that there is a kind of what's Valis stand for? Vast active living intelligence system, something which is completely kind of beyond and hyper, but nonetheless has a kind of saving function. Some of the earlier books, I mean, the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, you have again all these drugs which create bizarre reality distortions. You have some kind of alien interference, though it's unclear what it is. It doesn't anyway seem as benevolent or as even potentially benevolent as say Valis and some of the very later books are. So
it's a straight up invasion in Three Stigmata.
Yeah, but I mean, it's kind of the middle period Dick is kind of both how this hyper paranoid logic is both something completely alien, which is destroying us from within, but it's also a kind of hyperbole of how our systems already work. So it's kind of in between. I mean, there's a lot of Marxist critics, and I'm sort of a Marxist interest in Dick, and this goes back to when there was a famous meeting in like early 70s between several American science and Canadian science fiction critics, including Frederick Jameson, who's probably the best known one. They all had lunch with Dick, and their reports is that it was a kind of very pleasant lunch. But then Dick wrote this letter, though he didn't actually send it, to the FBI about how these are communists and they're trying to make me defect to the Eastern Bloc, and it's all a plot by Stanislaw Lem, except I don't really believe Stanislaw Lem's one person. I think it might be a committee of 3 or 4 different people. I mean, it's just really, it's totally nuts. And the people like the American critics who had dinner, lunch with Dick, it was a normal, he was really interesting. He talked a lot. There was no hostility or anything like that. And yet in his mind, he had this, totally crazy paranoid reaction to it. So, I mean, Dick is what, I mean, part of what's great about Dick is that he's willing to go where where no person has gone before. I mean, in the sense that he takes a logic or a kind of sense of how things fit together and then sees there's something really weird here, something that doesn't work or doesn't make sense here, and then he just pushes it further and further and further. And most science fiction writers or most people in general don't dare to speculate. Well, they either don't dare to speculate to that extreme, or else they become so completely nuts that they just write babbling nonsense. It's very
So
hard.
is he a confabulator, speculator? Where do you generalize he might fit in?
I mean, he's definitely moving through all those. I think he's definitely fabulating in the sense which I was trying to use, and that he's I mean, I don't know. I don't like to use the word myth because sometimes myth has too heady concept, and I really don't like the kind of hero's journey kind of stuff, which seems to me to be bullshit because it's trying to apply to everything with something which is only one very narrow thing. But myths as kind of general ways in which our minds try to make sense of things which exceed our intellectual capacity. How do you deal with that? And that fabulation is one way of doing that. And Dick is, taking a world where he has, he often has the, old, no longer existent small town Americana of the past. And then he has things that invaded, and things that invaded are usually things like technologies or commodities or marketing or whatever. And that always get mixed up with drugs, which are mind altering and both controlling and liberating in different ways. I mean, that for me is, in my scheme, I would call fabulation, but classifying is less important than just seeing, what happens when the way that Dick runs with this. And as I said, usually people either pull back, they're scared to go as far as he did, or they do go as far as he did, but they become completely babbling insane and have nothing you can use or react to. And so Dick is sort of on that very fine line, because we know that he himself is kind of weirdly paranoid in these various ways he dramatizes in the book, but he has this kind of control over it. And that's, partly why he's such a fascinating author, I think.
Well, and I think you're right. And I was just asked to speak there's a political philosopher at Fullerton that asked me to speak to his class about PKD and why PKD was important. And we exchanged these emails, and I basically was trying to make the argument that the thing that makes Phil so important is because very few people that are on the edge like he is have broken through to get published.
Well, it's not, it's sort of like, I don't know. I mean, this is my model of creativity in general. You sort of have part of your brain which is just fabulating, which is creating, babbling all this stuff. If you just let it out, then you're a crazy person. If you do what most of us do, we repress it. I think somebody who's creative in the way Dick was, and the way other great writers, whether science fiction or any kind of, create art, is you somehow have a balance between letting the stuff out when it's in its craziness and filtering it in some way, but not repressing it as much as 99% of the people, myself included, just repress it because life would be unlivable if you let it out. And if you just let it out without a filter, then it's not going to be interesting. It's just going to be, you're just going to be trapped inside your own solipsism. So the
Which
kind of
I wonder,
creativity is very difficult because it has to go mediate between the two of those.
and Stephen, do you feel like, because I do, that that's one of the reasons why the realism novels don't really work, is because he's trying to restrain that part of his imagination.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, but in general, it's like, there've been all kinds of arguments among literary critics about realism and surrealism and non-realism and, fabulation and science fiction and fantasy and all those kinds of things. And I try to resist tight compartments because these things all spill over each other in weird ways. But yeah, I mean, if you control it too much, then it becomes boring. And if you don't control it enough, it becomes incomprehensible and solipsistic. So it's that's why, great creativity is not so common, but why you can't say where it'll come from.
So in 2014, you published a book called The Universe of Things on Speculative Realism. And I have not read this book yet, but it's on my list. And one of the reasons why is it seems like you're dealing with a lot of Dickian themes in this book and on our conceptions of how we view the universe through
Well,
this
yeah.
stuff.
Okay. Well, speculative realism is it's a philosophical movement, which I was responding to when I wrote that book. So if I wrote it in 2014, probably speculative realism starts in the late 2008, 2007, 2008. And there's still speculative realist philosophers today, though it's become less fashionable. But I mean, basically, here's the question. So our brain, we don't just get raw phenomena fed into our own brains. Our brains organize that in some sort of way. But to what extent does organizing it distort it as opposed and is there any way that we can be affected by the reality out there aside from our our sort of frameworks or the cages in which we put them in to make sense of them? And the speculative realist philosophers are very different from each other. They all were trying to sort of think beyond the idea that the categories we impose on things somehow exhaust the things. Or, I mean, this goes back to the 18th century, Immanuel Kant in the 18th century and even beyond. But I mean, so it seemed to me to be a really interesting philosophy. It was raising questions which I mean, I'm not an expert in philosophy. I'm not a philosopher, so I'm reading it from a more literary or even science fictional point of view than professional philosophers would. But I mean, again, the question was sort of what does it mean to talk about reality outside of our conception of reality? I mean, in certain sense, it's impossible because if it's not a part of our conception of reality, how can we say anything about it? On the other hand, if we see that our conception of reality is a kind of cage and that things may happen outside of that, in other words, it's an inherently kind of thing which calls for speculation, fabulation in various ways. But anyway, this was a kind of philosophical movement, and I tried to write about it in connection with some of the other things I'm interested in, which include science fiction, but also include other strains in recent philosophy. But anyway, so the title, "The Universe of Things," starts. It's a phrase from Percy Shelley, the Romantic poet, in his poem, I think, Mont Blanc, which is about contemplating the sublimity of this mountain, which goes beyond, has this immense powers which are beyond anything we can imagine. And there's a passage in that poem about the universe of things pours through the mind. But a universe of things is exterior to the mind, even though it pours through the mind. Okay, so the British science fiction writer Gwyneth Jones wrote a short story called The Universe of Things, where she didn't refer to Shelley, but she was taking the title and she was playing with this kind of idea. And she was writing about Earthlings and aliens and different ways of conceiving reality and what happens if these other things sort of somehow exceed our own ability to understand reality. So that was sort of the germ of it, taking the romantic poem and the short story by Gwyneth Jones and putting it in this larger framework and having a way to rethink what the philosopher is saying in a kind of science fictional way almost. But I don't know, I had trouble with that also because I wrote something else about Gwyneth Jones a few years before and she hated it. So it's one of these things where you write about a living science fiction writer, and what I'm saying about them is totally laudatory, but they think you just gotten them wrong completely. So I never know what to do with that. But anyway, nonetheless, I used her story, and I went back to the Shelley poem, and then went to her story, and then used it as a way to think about all these other things. So
Well, and I went further than I wanted to, but without talking about Neptune Frost. But I think we need to get there
okay,
a little bit too. I don't know if anybody got a chance to watch it this week. I did try to promote it to people, but uh, why did you decide that this was a movie that you wanted to write a book about? It's a
well,
very interesting movie for sure.
okay. It said okay.
And it has Dickian themes, by the way.
Yeah, though there are several. There's a story here. Okay, so Neptune Frost is co-directed by a husband and wife team, Saul Williams and Anisia Uzeman. Saul Williams is an American rapper and poet and performance artist. Anisia Uzeman is a filmmaker from Rwanda, and they're a married couple. Okay, I was familiar with Saul Williams already because of his music and poetry. Okay, so literally what happened was they put out a Kickstarter thing to make this movie. And I said, well, I like Saul Williams. He's a really interesting artist, so I'll contribute $25 for to the Kickstarter. Okay, so they apparently, the story is they got almost $200,000 from the Kickstarter. And they use that, part of that to get investors, and they made the movie itself is cost $1 million. Okay, so it's a movie made entirely in Rwanda, and all the actors come from either Rwanda or Burundi, which is going to be next to Rwanda. It's in 5 languages. It's in English, French, Swahili, which is a lingua franca in that part of Africa, and the Burundian and Rwandan languages. And it it's hard to describe because it's a science fiction musical. It's both science fiction film and a musical. Okay, so I mean, it's an extremely unusual film. And partly I wanted to write about it because I was just fascinated by it. I ended up writing a short book about it because it's very hard to write about. So when I was trying to write shorter things like just an essay or just a few paragraphs and something else, it just didn't work. I had to focus on the film as much as possible. And my book is part of a series of books about movies, in which the idea is to analyze the movie by going through it minute by minute and talking about every single minute. You divide the movie up. Now, obviously, the editing might not, but you comment about minute 1 of the film, then you comment on minute 2 of the film, all the way until you get to the end of the film. And there are actually 2 presses which have series of books about this. So the series my book is in, there's several books that come out already. One is about Gus Van Sant's movie Jerry. Another one is about one of Spike Lee, which is Spike Lee's movie. Spike Lee's Malcolm X, I think. No. I'm blanking, but one of Spike Lee's movies. And the other series has a friend of mine has written the first volume in the series about the old movie The Bride of Frankenstein. I don't think it's out yet. But anyway, so the ideas of this, I mean, it's kind of a challenge or a game. How do you write about a movie? There are various ways film critics write about movies. This is a special way because it requires you to look at it in kind of weird detail, because you're supposed to write like a paragraph or so about every minute of the film. If you have a 100-minute film and I wrote maybe 300 words about each minute, makes a 30,000-word book. It was a way for me of coming to grips with the film. And as I said, but I'd more like rather talk about the film. The film is a science fiction musical. So it's about 2 things. It's about mineral resources and it's about gender. So one theme has to do with there's a mineral called coltan, which is mined in various places in the world, but there's a sort of small area of Africa, Eastern Congo and Rwanda and Burundi. So Congo is a big country, but it's a small part of it next to Rwanda and Burundi, which are very small countries, produces 70% of the world's coltan. So coltan is this mineral which is used to extract tantalum. Coltan, the name is tantalum is part of coltan. So it's used to extract tantalum. And this is necessary for every electronic device has capacitors, needs tantalum capacitors. So all our computers, all our phones, all our advanced electronic devices use coltan, and they mine it from this area in Africa where most of the coltan comes from. But of course, the mining is under exploitative conditions, and then it comes to the US and to Western Europe, and they make these devices. And then at the end of the process, when computers and phones and other electronic devices have become obsolete, or they don't work anymore, or they're being thrown out because they're newer models, they often ship the junk back to the same areas in Africa where they originally got the coltan from. So you literally have these places in Rwanda and Burundi where there are coltan mines, and then 5 miles away there's a dump where they just dump all these old electronics, computer monitors and transistors and phones and crap. So that's itself very weird. So that's
it also has this kind of, are we in a dream? Are we not?
It's more, but a lot of it, it's about, exploitation, since it begins and ends in Africa, but the Africans don't see the benefits from it. The other theme is gender. So the main character in the movie starts out as a man and becomes a woman in the course of the movie. And it's unclear exactly how, I mean, they don't give details on how this happens or how their genitalia work or whatever, but I mean, it's the whole thing of metamorphosis and transgressing boundaries between male and female and stuff like that. And it actually fits in with some old African legends, but it also um, goes against both sort of normative or mainstream heterosexuality in the West, and also in some African countries they've actually illegalized same-sex relation, not in Rwanda, but in some of the, and the reason they've illegalized is because of U.S. missionaries who go to like places like Uganda. Uganda has very severe anti-gay laws, and the anti-gay laws have nothing to do with like African tradition. They have to do with fundamentalist Christian missionaries from the U.S. who have gone there and have influenced people to pass these laws. So the movie is about exploitation, both in terms of and colonization, both in terms of this mineral, which is used for electronics, which then becomes dumped when it's garbage, and in terms of gender formations, which are fluid, but which Christian American missionaries have made illegal, have used their influence to make illegal in some African countries. So it's a political film, but it's also, I mean, as I said, it's a political film, but it doesn't have, it's not a kind of propaganda film. It's the other thing is that it's a musical, as I said. Saul Williams is a hip hop artist, and he wrote all the. So Saul Williams wrote the screenplay and the music, and his wife, who's a filmmaker, is responsible for the cinematography, and they hired another person to be editor the editing. And so it's a kind of hybrid project. Aside from Saul Williams, who's American, everybody connected with the film was from Rwanda and Burundi, which is why it was made relatively cheaply, but they brought it back to America to be edited and released. And so it has this kind of in-between status. So it's both about gender and about minerals and technology. And it's done in this, I mean, basically, to the extent there's a plot, and it's not very plot heavy, but it's about these people escape from oppression by going to this utopian place in the jungle where they sort of set up a liberated community, and certain powers they have, especially the power of the person who changes gender from male to female, leads to a disruption of worldwide internet reception, which leads to military attack and destruction of the enclave, but which leaves you in the end with hope for continued resistance and continued fighting. So it's a kind of parable about power and resistance, how it relates both to minerals and technology and to formation of gender. But it's also, again, it's a musical. I mean, it's not like an old Hollywood musical where they have this big song and dance numbers. It's like a lot of lines which in normal movies would be spoken are instead sung. And so these different kinds of music, it's not like a traditional musical in the old Hollywood sense, but it's kind of a lot of stuff is sung. There's a lot of music in it. It's sort of woven through. Sometimes people are making music and dancing, but other times when in a normal movie, somebody would just be saying, oh, this is what I came from here and this is what I did. They'd be singing it. So it's a very.
It can be rented on YouTube for $4. So
it can be rented, I mean, on all the streaming services. You can get it from, Amazon, Apple, etc. So
and people
you
should
can see it
definitely
for
check
$3
it
or
out.
$4. I really recommend it. It's such an unusual movie. It's not like anything else I've ever seen, and it's fascinating. It's very multifarious, and it combines these science fiction themes with these political themes with these kind of musical efflorescence. So I don't know. I just think it's an amazing film. It's
And
not well known.
Stephen, the filmmakers are going to be able to read your book.
Well, I hope they do. I hope they like. I mean, as I said, whenever I write about anybody contemporary, I just hope they like what I wrote about them. And as I said, I've had some science fiction writers hated what I wrote about them, but some who liked what I wrote about them. So,
Yeah.
what
Well,
can I
hey,
say?
yeah. So I do we've gone over time as we often do.
Okay.
Does anybody want to last anybody questions? Raise your hand if you got them. But I'm going to start wrapping up here in a second. But Stephen, tell folks how they can find you and your work.
You can find, well, my books are all, you can buy them all from Amazon or whatever. I've written 13 books, and then one in Neptune Force will be the 14th. It comes out next year. So I mean, you can buy my books on Amazon or any other online bookseller. Um, I post on Facebook, and mostly on Facebook, occasionally also on Blue Sky and Blue Sky, and even Twitter occasionally. No, usually it's just Blue Sky, but it's mostly Facebook. So that's where you can find me. I don't know, fulminating or doing stuff from moment to moment.
Yeah, keep posting about the movies that you watch. That I appreciate that, because those people who have really good taste,
Well, there are different degrees. I mean, as I said, I have a blog, though it's not very active, but I do write it a couple times, and then I usually put a note on Facebook and in Blue Sky that I've posted to the blog.
Are you going to be at the Speculative Fiction Cross Media Conference again in
Yes,
LA?
I'm planning to be there again.
Okay, good.
Give
That's
some
where
what
Steve and
I'm
I
trying
hung out
to.
last year. And
Yeah.
I will and I'm gonna be having Patrick on at some point to promote that conference again.
Yeah, that's great.
Coming up in July. It's a great conference, and especially for us West Coasters.
It's in September. It's in September this year. It's in October last year. This year it's in September.
Yep.
And it's in Monterey Park area of Los Angeles.
Yep. And we'll be having Patrick on in July to talk about the conference. Because this year the themes are very Dickian with artificial intelligence and virtual realities. So I've already got my paper proposals in, and we'll see how it goes. But Stephen, it was awesome to have you. You're more than welcome to stick around. I know it's late in your neck of the woods, so
I think it's after. I mean, I don't go to bed that early, but it's after 10 and on the East Coast, and so I'm in the Eastern time zone. So
right. But you're more than welcome to stay. For the Dickheads at home, please make sure to like, share, subscribe, all that stuff. And as always, Dickheads, keep it paranoid, stay paranoid. We'll be back with another episode.
Okay, bye, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Stephen. And cut.